last week, we were on page 2 of the unfortunate widow, and there were a few more things concerning widows that I wanted to say. I pointed out that Luke, of all 4 gospel writers, devotes more attention to widows than any of the others. In fact, all the others put together. And why, I do not know. But anyway, we read about the Pharisees devouring widows' houses. That means they kicked them out. They knew the legal maneuvers. The main thing that succeeded with the Pharisees was that they could make these widows feel religiously guilty. Religiously guilty. They had no conscience. The widows did have a conscience. And as a result, they lost their house. And they had to, buddy up with someone else. Look at, let's go to Luke chapter 21 again and talk about the widow who put in the 2 mites. What is your idea as to how much her 2 mites equaled? What do you think? All right. A half a penny. 1 mite is a quarter of a cent. 2 mites making a half a cent. And the Lord commended her because she did what? All she had. She did not put in part of it and keep part of it. She put in all she had, while the rich came and put in of their excess. They did not make a sacrifice. What is a sacrifice? That's right. You're going to be put in a pinch to do it. If you can do it and not be put in a pinch, that is not a sacrifice. And we are to be living what? Sacrifices unto God. We are to inconvenience ourselves for God. That's the bottom line. And if we're not willing to do that, then we ought not to claim to be his disciples. So in Luke 21, verses 1 through 4, he looked up and saw the rich men that were casting their gifts into the treasury, and he saw a certain poor widow casting in thither 2 mites, and he said, of a truth I say unto you, this poor widow cast in more than they all, for she did of her superfluity cast in unto the gifts, but she of her want did cast in all the living she had. Now, I said last week that the treasury is what? Morning, Susan.
Good morning.
The treasury was composed of 13 trumpets. They called them trumpets. These are big vases like this, big at the mouth, narrow, and then they bubbled out at the bottom. And when we talk about trumpets later on in the New Testament, the Pharisees were carrying these trumpets around and shaking them, jingling the money on the inside. All right, that's the word trumpets. It refers to the repository of this their monies that came from the sale of property as well as other means. There were 13 of them in the part of the temple called the Court of the Women. There were 2 extra ones kept in a chamber or a secret chamber, trumpets, and 15. And these 30 money into these other 2 trumpets, did it secretly. Nobody knew when they went in there. They could see everybody going in and dumping into these other treasuries, these other 13 trumpets. But nobody could see what was being done here. That's why it's called a secret chamber, because it was secretly put into. And out of those two treasuries came the money for the children of the poorer people to be educated. The Jews have always taken care of their own, always. To this day, there's no such thing as a poor Jew, because the nation of Israel will take care of them. And it's much like the American Indian. They take care of their own far better than America takes care of their own. Now, the court of the women. If you can picture this wall being the outward perimeter of the temple, and the inside pews representing the temple proper. Here we have the court of the Gentiles on the outside. There are 8 entrances into this temple complex, okay? 8 entrances. The court of the Gentiles simply means the court into which circumcised Gentiles only can go, but can go no farther. Okay? They cannot go any farther. The court of the women means that the women can go into that court, but they cannot go any farther. Then you have the court of the Israelites. Israelites could go in there, but they could not go any farther. All right. Then you have the court of the priests. They could go in there, but they could go no farther. And beyond the court of the priests was the holy house, or the sanctuary, made up of the holy place and the holy of holies. All right. So as you enter, now this treasury was in the court of the women. Most all the circumstances that take place in the New Testament, where all the people were gathered together in the temple, they were gathered together in the court of the women. The court of the women. That's where 90% of the teaching took place. So when Peter and John went back to the temple, they went to the court of the women, because everybody could go there except circumcised Gentiles. They had their parameters, and that was the court of the Gentiles. Leading into the court of the women, as you are walking up to it, you will step up 14 steps to the terrace or to the porch that goes around all 3 sides of that court of the women. And a lot of preaching and teaching went on in these terraces. Then, as you step up 5 more steps, you enter into the actual court of the women. So right now, I'm not in the court of the women. I'm right in front of it, all right? But I can go on all 3 sides, and a pretty big terrace, all right? Pretty big porch or colonnade, if you will. Then, as I want to go into the court of the women, I make these 5 steps. Now, the temple always was higher as you went further inside. Ground level was the court of the Gentiles. Then you go up 14 steps to the colonnade or the terraces of the court of the women. You go up 5 more steps to the actual court of the women. Then when you want to go to the court of the Gentiles, you go up another 9 steps. If you want to go to the court of the priests, you go up more steps. Into the holy place, more steps. So it's higher and higher as you go further inward into the temple. The gate called Beautiful was the gate in Acts 3. Turn to Acts 3, if you will. Acts 3, 1 through 3. Now Peter and John were going up into the temple at the hour of prayer. Where were they going? What particular spot in that temple? Remember what I said? The court of the women. How do I know this? We keep reading. And a certain man that was lame from his mother's womb was carried, whom they laid daily at the door of the temple, which is called Beautiful. That temple door led directly into the court of the women. And so as Peter and John were going into the court of the women, this lame man was laid there on those 5 steps leading into the gate Beautiful. So that's how we know where Peter and John were going to continue to preach the word. Why do you think it was called the gate Beautiful? Because it was beautiful? Yes, that's right. All right. The gate Beautiful, well, let me finish reading. Let's go into Acts 3. Let me continue reading in Acts 3. To ask alms of them, and entered into the temple, that's the court of the women, who, seeing Peter and John about to go into the temple, asked to receive alms. And Peter, fastening his eyes upon him with John, said, "Look on us." In other words, look at us right now. And he gave heed unto them. And then Peter said, "Look, silver and gold, we don't have any, but we will give you what we have." And they immediately healed this lame man. The gate Beautiful was 75 feet tall. 75 feet. It took 20 Levites to open the doors and 20 to close the doors. We can't imagine the grandeur of the temple. Do you know what the Jews put on the front of the temple, the whole front? Sheets of gold. The whole front of the temple was solid gold. In front, or from your perspective, behind the gate Beautiful was Solomon's porch. Let's say back here, all right? Solomon's porch. It had 162 columns. It was a colonnade, all right, which was a big, wide open porch. And it was on the east side. Herod's porch was on the southeast side. 162 columns, 41 feet high, all marble. It took 3 men to touch their hands around these columns. We can't imagine that, can we? And yet the temple of Apollo was far more grandeur than the temple of the Jews. I'll give you a description of that one time if I'm given an opportunity. All right. The gate Beautiful was made out of Corinthian brass, the finest metal in that known world, better than silver and gold. So in the morning, when the east sun hit that gate, it just almost blinded you. And that's where they get the term beautiful. It was a beautiful gate because of the tremendous shine as the sun reflects its rays off that door. So when they go inside, there are 4 corners, as most all rooms have: A, B, C, and D. And these were where these 13 treasures were kept. In the corner, they had corner chambers, like this office right here. All right? And outside that chamber were these treasures, these trumpets into which the people put their money. Now in Acts chapter 6, verse 1, Someone read that for me. Now, Luke also, having written the book of Acts, refers to these widows. Here's another reference to widows. Acts 1, 6:1, if someone will read it. Okay. There was a squabble in the early church. How long does it take for trouble to raise its ugly head? I mean, it's almost instant, isn't it? The church was established, and in less than 1 year, they have this problem. And they continue to have problems, and we continue to have problems. That's the nature of humanity. There's always going to be somebody to cause a stink, and there are going to be those who follow them. The problem was that the Grecian widows were being neglected. The Hebrew widows were being favored. Now, what is the difference between a Hebrew widow and a Grecian widow? All right. In this instance, Hebrew widows were born within Palestine. Grecian widows were born outside Palestine. And that's a simple differentiation. There's far more to it than Dale's translation said Hellenized. And that comes as a result of the generals of Alexander the Great Grecianizing, trying to Grecianize the Jewish world. The Hellenistic Jews always used the Septuagint, okay? The Hebrew Jews used the Masoretic text, the original Hebrew text. But the Hellenized Jews would not do that. So the apostles at this time, this is in Acts chapter 6, were in charge of the distribution of funds. Every day, money was poured out of a couple of these chests that were designated for the widows and the poor. They had all kinds of reasons. You have to buy the wood, all right, furnish the wood for the fire in order to offer the sacrifices. They paid for the wood. They paid for the oil. They paid for the incense. They paid for all the golden vessels. They paid for the censers. They paid for everything. So that's the reason Jews gave. And they always gave liberally to the temple. It didn't matter how much. They didn't want to give a nickel to the Roman government, but they would give their life for the temple. And every day, these apostles would pour out of a couple of these trumpets, these depositories, money to take care of the widows and the poor. And that's the emphasis throughout the New Testament. To remember, James says, to remember the fatherless and the widows in their affliction. What does it mean to remember or to visit? Some translations say visit. It means take care of them. And then Paul talks about those who are widows and those who are widows in deed, not in need, but in deed. What's the difference? Exactly. That's right, Dale. Some of them were not widows indeed. These widows indeed had nobody. And the Greek word there is cataloged. They had to be cataloged in order that the church would know which ones do we take care of. And so here we have the court of the women that's referred to several times in the New Testament. It's just not called court of the women. You have to read between the lines. So when Peter and John were in prison and they were told, don't you go back to the temple and start preaching this heresy, what did they do? They get up and they go right back to the court of the women. And that's where they were arrested, in the court of the women. 75 feet tall. I can't imagine a door that tall. I can't imagine it. All right. Then the Jews were sad because that temple did not match the glory of Solomon's temple. And so what does Herod do? They're mad at him anyway. He's a foreigner. He's just a sorry piece of trash. So he starts refurbishing and remodeling the temple. But remember, they can only go east. West, all your government building, all your housing. And they had the valley, the Tyropian Valley, on the west side of the holy and most holy place. So he has to go to the right. But to the right, there's the Kidron Valley, 114 feet deep. So how do you think he solves this dilemma? And he's going to pay for it out of the state treasury, by the way. All right? He won't tax them for this money. He has workers to go down, and I've got my references on this, Josephus and Barnes. He has his workers go down to the bottom of that valley and roll big boulders up against the western wall, from your perspective, against the western wall of the valley. Now, here's the temple over here, all right? And interlaces these big boulders with liquid lead. They are still there today. Eyewitnesses say you can see them today. And then more boulders and more boulders, liquid lead, more boulders, liquid lead. And here is that western boundary of the Kidron Valley. He builds it up so that he can expand the ground level. And that's how he can expand the temple. He built the temple over the Kidron Valley. And that foundation never broke to this day. 2,000 years ago, and it's still there. The temple is not, but the ground foundation is. The temple is one of the most mesmerizing studies I've ever engaged in. It's absolutely a kind of study that you drop your jaws on, thinking of all the expense and the time. And what I've just told you is a thumbnail of information on the temple. And these people met at the temple every day to pray and to worship God. Every day. And many of them several times a day. The apostles were constantly in the temple, in and out of the temple. All right. So I've touched on the widow who gave her 2 mites in the court of the women. I've touched on the widows who are being neglected in the daily ministration. And by the way, the apostles were in charge of the distribution of these receptacles. And yet later, just before the 7 were chosen as deacons in the Lord's church, what did they tell the people? It is not meet or proper for what? For us to serve tables. In other words, we've been doing this, but we can no longer do it. We have got to go preach the gospel. We are going to select 7 men who will do this. And that's the reason they brought forth these new deacons, so that they can take care of the widows and leave the apostles to preaching the gospel. But at the time of Acts 6:1, the apostles had not yet relinquished that responsibility. Do you have any questions that you want to ask? Mm-hmm. So Chuck, when you think about it, This goes for all of you, but it's in light of what Chuck just said. In Acts 16, when Paul sees this vision in Troas, then he and his entourage go across to Macedonia. They go to Philippi. And whom do they encounter in Philippi? What woman? Lydia. She was a seller of purple. That was a very exquisite material, expensive. And in some other study, I'll tell you exactly what, say, a purple robe cost in U.S. money. You won't believe it. So she was a very wealthy woman. And she sold only to the rich because those were the only ones who could buy it. And let's see. Let me get back to my thought. Wayne, what was I going to say? Oh, I know what it is. Something Chuck said. All right. So when Paul, Silas go to Philippi, where do they find these women? First of all, when they ask about some women, what do the townspeople say? You'll find them out there by the riverside, about a mile away from the city, and they're worshiping God. He goes out there. It's an open air, worship center, if I may say it that way. That's called an oratory. An oratory. It is a synagogue with no walls. That's what an oratory is. Then they built synagogues. Okay? They had the tabernacle in Moses' day. And then they had this oratory. And they had the synagogue. Then they built the temple. These are places that God designated to be worshiped at. All right? Specific places. And today, there is no particular place. Because in John 4, what does Jesus say to the Samaritan woman? Woman at the well? Not in this mountain or that mountain, not in any physical place. We can worship God anywhere, but these were some of the places, Chuck, that were designated as places where people would worship God. Excuse me.
Looking back at all the different ways, the different places that we had to worship. And now we worship in our body. There's always been rules on how to worship. And we still have rules today. We can't do whatever we want in worship.
Contrary to what the world says.
Yes.
That's a good book. There have always been rules.
And it's been life or death at times.
That's right.
When those rules are broken.
When they break those rules, we parents establish rules in our household. Schools establish rules. Employers have rules for their employees to follow. And yet when it comes to religion, the world doesn't want to follow rules. And they're going to pay a hefty price for this. I'm sad to say that, and I'm not happy. But that's the price. They choose to live this way. So now they're going to have to dance to the music. All right, that's a very good point. So back to the temple. So I keep changing directions, thinking which is the best. I'm here in Solomon's Porch, and I go a little further, and I come to the 14 steps that lead to the terrace covered porch around the court of the women. I go a little further, I climb 5 more steps, I'm in the court of the women. As I go through the court of the women, I come to the steps called the Nicanor Gate or the Nicanor Steps, and I will go up these 9 steps, and I'm in the court of the Gentiles. Then I go a little further, and there are steps leading to the court of the priests. Nobody but priests could go into that court. So when people came to offer their lamb, their daily lamb in the morning and in the evening, it had to be sacrificed at the temple. Well, what part of the temple? They went through the court of the Israelites. The priest would meet them at the partition that separates the court of the Israelites from the court of the priests. He would take their lamb from them. He would go to the altar and sacrifice it. He would bring their lamb back to them and hand it. There were a lot of priests taking care of these daily sacrifices, and there were stationary men that helped them. Stationary men were not priests. They were not necessarily Levites. They were assistants to the priests. It's much like in the government. There are a lot of lower class assistants. They have to have these. So these stationary men, in fact, when a woman had to be purified after giving birth to a child, how many days after giving birth to a girl? 80. How many days did she have to wait before being purified, giving birth to a boy? 40. And women, I have no idea. Ask me why. They didn't have to go to the temple to be purified. A stationary man could come to them. All right? But most of them did go to the temple. And so they would go through this process, and they would be purified in the court of the women. Paul, when he was in Cenchrea, shaved his head. Why did he shave his head? He had taken the Nazirite vow, and it had come to an end. When the Nazirite vow ends, you shave your head. But that was supposed to be done at the temple. He's in Cenchrea. He can't be at the temple. And so later on, he makes his way to the temple, and that's where he offers his sacrifices of purification and things like that. So hopefully this picture of the temple will give you a little idea about some of these stories concerning these widows. On page 2, again, do any of you need a lesson on the important widow? All right. Oh, by the way, Celeste and Jason, I like the name Jet. I like that. Jet. And that, I'll guarantee you, he will be going like a jet through your house, right, Carl? He will be another Barrett. All right. As you study this parable, try to see it in its Eastern setting. I've always said this. Don't interpret these parables from the American mindset. You won't get the proper picture. Try to transpose yourself into ancient Near Eastern society. The courtroom was not a fine building, but a tent that was moved from place to place as the judge made his circuit. Who was one of the greatest circuit judges of all time? Old Testament. He was a man. Name starts with S. Samuel. He was the greatest circuit judge of all time. The judge and not the law set the agenda. And he sat regularly in the tent surrounded by his assistants. Anybody could watch the proceedings from the outside, but only those who were approved or accepted could have their cases tried. In other words, those were the only ones who could come inside the tent. This usually meant bribing. Modern day, sound a little like modern day to us. All right, this meant bribing one of the assistants so that he would call the judge's attention to the case. And that's what your wealthy people did. They bought their way through life. I had a friend of mine one time. I say a friend, acquaintance. I just met him at a funeral. I was preaching the funeral of one of his members, family members. And he came up to me and said he was a lawyer in Dallas. He said, I have to get out. I have to change professions. He said, there is more money being exchanged under the table than you will ever imagine. Between lawyers, between judges, clients and lawyers, clients and judges, lawyers and judges, and money being exchanged everywhere. Everybody buys their legal rights or the judicial sentence, however you want to say it. He said, I cannot, as a Christian, continue in this profession. And that's going on right today. Right today. All right. Now, the widow had a couple of obstacles to overcome. Number one, she was a woman. So she had very little standing before the law. Do you realize that a woman's testimony could not be accepted into a court unless it pertained to her husband? Then she could verify his infidelity or whatever problems were existing in their marriage. In the Palestinian society of our Lord's day, women did not go to court. Since she was a widow, she had no husband to go to bat for her in legal matters. How many of you women have taken a car to a repair shop and you were kind of given the raw deal? But when a man shows up, and I've done this before, I would show up and take up for that woman. And I'm sure many of you men have done it. All of a sudden, the auto repairman gives a different assessment. I don't know why women have always been short-sighted, but they have. All right, so since she was a widow, she had no husband to go to bat for in legal matters. She was poor and could not pay a bribe even if she wanted to. No wonder poor widows did not always get the protection the law was supposed to afford them. There was a widow. Here is a widow who has been robbed of what little she had. This widow doubtless was a symbol of all who were poor and defenseless. They were desolate, helpless, and friendless. It is obvious that she, without resources of any kind, had no hope of ever obtaining justice from this kind of judge. She was without influence and money, thus unable to bribe. She lived in the same city with the judge and kept coming to him. This is seen in that the word came is in the imperfect tense. The imperfect tense in Greek is something we don't have. Means something done in past time over and over and over and over. So she continually hounded this judge. But she had one potent weapon, persistence. Persistence. Be honest with me, parents. How many times have you given in to your children because they would not let it go? Is there anybody here who said they've never done that? Lance, are you guilty? Cody? We are guilty. Why did we give in? Get them off our backs. That's exactly why we gave in. All right, so here is this woman, and she had persistence. Avenge me means vindicate me, make this opponent at law. And when I put something in italics, that's what the Greek says. All right, this opponent at law return his extortion and robbery and inflict on him the penalty he deserves. Don't just give me back what is mine. You punish that guy. All right? Oh, by the way, Jared, have you ever given in to your kids like that? No. Yeah, you do your grandkids. Oh, no. All right. Look at page 3. Though I fear not God nor regard man, he would not, again, imperfect, continually, would not give in. And yet, because this widow troubleth me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. All right, because this widow troubleth me, literally, because of the furnishing me trouble as to this widow. The judge feared physical reprisal. Now, he's not afraid of this woman hitting him physically. Troubleth is the Greek word exhausts. She exhausts me. She wears me out. And it wasn't that long ago that Carl brought this to our attention in a sermon. And I thought this was a tremendous point you brought out, Carl. Lest she give me a black eye. You remember Carl saying that? Do you? Not the widow's unquestioned right or her opponent's flagrant wrong against her moved this judge. For his own personal ease and peace of mind he gave in. But he thought that by her continually coming to him, she would be mentally knocking him out. And not that the widow would physically hurt the judge. She would beat him down and wear him out. She'd give him a black eye, figuratively speaking. All right? And the Lord said, hear what the unjust judge saith. Jesus asked his disciples to reflect upon what this unscrupulous judge had concluded to do. This includes his motive, his selfishness, and his final actions. The unjust judge in Greek is the judge of unrighteousness. Both the law of God and the law of man were on the widow's side. But this judge thought this case was too insignificant to even waste his time with it. Shall not God avenge? Verse 7. This parable does not liken God to an unjust judge. It contrasts God to this person. Jesus was saying that if an unjust and wicked judge can be wearied into giving a widow woman justice, how much more will God, who is a loving Father, give his children what they need? How many of you prayed to God over and over and over and over for something? I hope that's all of us. One of your family members gets sick, you're not going to just pray to God once or twice, are you? It's going to be constantly on your mind. You're praying constantly. Heal him or heal her. Help them, ease them, relieve their pain, bring them back to their health over and over and over. And I'll guarantee you, God will give in many instances, unless there's something, let's say that their little body is lacking something. All right, maybe they have a liver that's eaten up and damaged, and the liver can't be healed without a miracle. God's not going to perform that miracle. Carl referred to just a couple of weeks ago about the law of parsimony. The law of parsimony means that God is not going to use his miraculous power if he can accomplish the same end through natural law. Okay? Was there any miracle in the preservation of baby Moses? No. The mama made an ark. She put it, pardon?
Unlikely.
Yeah. There were a lot of stories in the Bible where there was no miracle because God could accomplish that end through natural law. But now when the blind man came in and he spit in the dirt and made spittle and put it on his eyes, all right, there was, so the law of parsimony, and I really like that, Carl, because that's my cup of tea. Am I too early? No. Okay. Oh, all right. Thank y'all very much.